Good afternoon. It seems that we are live. Thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to host this webinar today about dirty tobacco with Telita Snyckers. And thank you for joining us. It's going to be a riveting, very, very interesting discussion. And we're looking forward to it. So Telita's book is fascinating. It brings in all the elements of criminal life, the apparent legality of it, the civility of it, loads of free-flowing cash, dirty games, which include spying, extortion and bribing, and then, of course, the smuggling and the money laundering and even the terrorism that funded by dirty tobacco. So while we are waiting for Telita to get online, let's test and see if she can hear us. Are you there?
I can hear you perfectly. Can you see me again?
Perfect. Thank you. We are so happy to have you here. I'm going to jump right in and introduce you. Telita is a trained lawyer. She's a constitutional expert. She's a long-time tax and customs boffin. She was an executive at SARS, who headed the Revenue Service's criminal investigations. And she's worked in more than 25 countries around the world relating to customs and tax affairs. She's taken a long time to investigate and research this book of hers, Dirty Tobacco. And she's one of those people that make us proud to be women to start off with and to be South Africans. I also want to thank all the daily Maverick insiders. Thank you for making this and all the other webinars possible. You guys have a very special place in our hearts. So Telita, we ran a poll around the tobacco current issue. I know you're not in the country, but in South Africa, as you know, we have a tobacco ban relating to the COVID-19 affair. So our people on the webinar today who took part in the poll said 42% of them have been affected by South Africa's cigarette ban. 13%, agree with the cigarette ban. So there's widespread condemnation, you can think. 32% have been buying or bootlegging cigarettes despite the ban. So this may be a very clear example of banning something will not suppress it. And people will find a way to smuggle something if it's important enough and if there's money, and that is the important thing here. So as you told us in your book, Tobacco, banning tobacco is as old as medieval times. And then on the other hand, tobacco has always fought back. So smuggling tobacco is more profitable than heroin, cocaine, marijuana, and guns, you said. Can you tell me, how can you substantiate a claim like that?
Well, so look, there is ample evidence that shows us that if you were to run an organized crime syndicate, or if you were to get involved in terrorism, for instance, the second biggest source of income for these syndicates or for terrorism organizations, only after oil, is smuggling cigarettes. Because it's light, it's small, it's easy to smuggle across borders, and the profit margins are simply astonishing. So on one container, you can make $2 million profit, right? If you had $150,000 to invest, you could easily, make $10 million profit. If 9 out of 10 of your containers was seized by the police or by the revenue agency, you would still make enough profit on the one remaining container out of 10 for it to be a profitable business for you. So the profit margins are simply astonishing.
That is amazing. And I don't think that we knew that. And it's, on the other hand, obviously very difficult to prosecute and to investigate any crimes, as opposed to a heroin or a cocaine that is very clearly illegal. With cigarettes, if you're not properly educated and trained to recognize perhaps what is meant as an illegal cigarette or bootlegging, you may not know that you've stumbled upon a crime.
Well, exactly. So cigarettes now are the world's most widely smuggled legal substance. So because cigarettes aren't inherently illegal, it's very difficult to identify, if you find a pack on the market, it's very difficult to distinguish between a illicit pack and an illegal one. And so that's why we start talking about things like marking cigarette packs, so that it's easy for you to see whether tax has in fact been paid on a pack or not.
It's fascinating. And if we have time, please remember this marking of cigarette boxes. I don't think that people really know, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it. But what is very fascinating further is that this book of yours was so powerful, and the facts that you exposed and brought to light was so on point, that the tobacco industry thought it better to try and offer you a job and to manipulate you to not release the facts in your book. Can you give us more detail? This is the perfect example of in the first instance, tobacco's reach. How did they know about your book? In the second instance, of the lengths they will go to. And in the third instance, the lengths they will go to ensure that they understand their market and manipulate their market.
Well, so look, something the tobacco industry is extremely good at is monitoring what they call anti-tobacco activists. Now, I'm not necessarily an anti-tobacco activist in the sense that I am not lobbying for, cigarettes smoking to be banned completely. But they are very good at monitoring people who are critical of the tobacco industry. When you look at some of their internal corporate affairs documents, they have people who specialize in identifying people who are vocal on, platforms like Twitter, speaking at things like conferences. And, they actually have very good tracking systems. So for instance, there's one really nice Excel spreadsheet from one of the tobacco companies where they list, a number of individuals, and then they denote, what are their interests, what are their weaknesses, what are their key positions in terms of specific issues that affect the tobacco industry. So they're extremely good at tracking people who might potentially pose a threat to the industry. I suspect you probably on one of those lists too. And so they make it their business to know where potential threats come from, and they make it their business to find ways to somehow diminish that risk. So it's simply a risk mitigation strategy on their part. And so I think they have different ways of mitigating the risk, and one of them is by offering, someone a job who could potentially be exposing some of their secrets.
Do you think they're monitoring us now, Telita?
Oh, I can guarantee there are lots of them watching this now. And I have some special messages for them, coming down the line. Oh, I can guarantee they've been watching, yes.
Good, let them watch. What the public will remember of way back of tobacco and cigarette products is Marlboro Man, and so cool to smoke. And you have this image of the ski guy who's coming down the Alps, and it's the thing to do if you're a strong, manly person. We remember smoking on airplanes, on the beach, and bars still. And one of the most horrific advertisements in history of tobacco products may be ones where they advertised an easier birth if you smoke as a woman because your fetus is smaller. I mean, that was just one of the most bizarre things and twist of a legitimate medical investigation into something that would help them market their products. Can you briefly, before we really get into this, tell us about how medical journals were used in advertisements and studies in a broad overview of let's say, international tobacco's dirty games?
Well, so, going back to the 1970s, a company like Philip Morris International set up the tobacco research, group. And their intention with that and with other similar organizations was to influence both medical opinion and kind of mainstream opinion in terms of the so-called, risks or potential risks from smoking. So for instance, they would come up with medical evidence that would suggest that it might not be smoking that's causing lung cancer, it might be coffee. And so they are very good at influencing what we see in medical journals. And so a lot of the medical journals initially were quite pro, claims like this is a healthier cigarette. And those claims were then reflected in some of the advertising. This is a healthier cigarette. Philip Morris had ads that said, if you smoke this, it'll burn your throat less. It's good for you. Yeah.
That's fascinating and worrying that the people can be so manipulated. And we will go into that a bit later, more in depth. But let's start with getting around the lingo, because we will dive into legal cigarettes being manufactured or smuggled, or and illegal manufactured tobacco products and cigarettes also being smuggled. And then there's something like counterfeit cigarettes and counterfeit tobacco products. Can you help us understand what we are about to talk?
Okay, so in essence, there are three types of cigarette manufacturers. The first would be the big multinational tobacco companies. So we're talking about things like, British American Tobacco, Japan Tobacco, Philip Morris, and Imperial. The second group of tobacco manufacturers would be smaller, typically regionally based manufacturers who make what are called low cost or value branded cigarettes or cheapies. So they don't make premium brands. And then the third category of tobacco manufacturers would be guys who manufacture explicitly for the illegal market. So they're not licensed, they're not registered. We don't know about them, they never pay taxes, and they simply make cigarettes specifically for the illegal market. What all three of these categories have in common is all of their products, to some extent, end up supplying the illicit tobacco market. So whether you're a big multinational, whether you're one of the smaller low-cost value manufacturers, or the guys who manufacture explicitly for the black market, all of those packs to some extent end up on the illicit market. And when we talk about illicit cigarettes or black market cigarettes in this context, it's very simply cigarettes that haven't had tax paid on them.
Okay, thank you. That's a very helpful explanation. This discussion we will break down in 4 sectors. Let's talk about the smuggling first. Then we'll talk about how we as the public are manipulated. We'll talk about how cigarette manufacturers or tobacco manufacturers is all about clawing back market share from themselves, from their competition. And then the question that you ask and address, are they too big to fail? So we talked about smuggling earlier on, and we know that it's as old as medieval times, and that since there's been a permanent scuffle between governments and tobacco manufacturers. So very interesting statistics in your book is that in 2010, British American Tobacco paid the European Commission around $200 million to settle smuggling related issues. Now we're talking about reputable companies, listed companies here. In the same year in Canada, 5 tobacco companies plead guilty to aiding persons to sell tobacco products not conforming with the Excise Act. Now that also sounds a lot like smuggling. And in 2012, another example, and there are many, I have 3 here. Canada files a racketeering lawsuit against R.J. Reynolds for $1 billion for smuggling between Canada and the United States. You described it as the perfect crime, and you gave us a bit of an overview about that already. So is it only about the impact in the loss of tax revenue? Or are there other factors supporting and surrounding smuggling of cigarettes and the massive mega profits that you're talking about?
Well, look, tobacco companies smuggle their packs for a number of reasons. The first one is to evade the taxes that are payable on the packs, but they also smuggle because some countries have very strict import conditions imposed on tobacco. So, for instance, we know that historically, China had import restrictions, so a foreign company couldn't import their cigarettes into the country. And so we know that during the 80s, British American Tobacco made 25% of their global profits from smuggling into China because it was the only way they could get their packs onto the local market. In fact, smuggling into...
Can you tell us, how do you know that?
Well, we know that because there was a time where especially the big tobacco companies really acted with impunity, and they had a bizarre habit of documenting pretty much everything that they were doing. And so we have minutes from meetings, we have faxes. This was back in the day of faxes. We have faxes being sent to the different offices. We have legal opinions where they explain how could we set up this structure so that we could have enough cigarettes to supply to the Chinese market. So we know what was happening in China because BAT was actually documenting the entire strategy for us. So their smuggling into China was so profitable that they actually decided not to set up a legal, a factory inside China itself, because it could never be as profitable as their smuggling business. A third reason why the companies would smuggle their own packs would be, in many countries, the sale of cigarettes is actually completely outlawed. So, for instance, at a point in time in Somalia, Al-Shabaab had prohibited the sale of cigarettes. And so there's also evidence that BAT in particular was smuggling their packs into Somalia in black plastic bags. So you smuggle to avoid taxes, but you also smuggle because it might be the only way to get your product into a country.
Okay, so mentioning of Eastern Africa, Horn of Africa, and Al-Shabaab, you also mentioned that the Taliban is smuggling tobacco products is their second biggest income after heroin. Can you tell us about that, and why would they rely on cigarettes?
Well, for a number of reasons. The first point I think that's important to make is that cigarette smuggling is not necessarily related to terrorist organizations in most parts of the world. So it's very few instances where you can draw a direct link between cigarette smuggling and terrorism in particular. And I'll get back to why this is important later. I think the reason why is because it's so profitable. And so, for instance, what we also know is these terrorist organizations might buy the packs and sell them on a different market. So not necessarily in the region that they themselves control. They don't necessarily want their own people to smoke. They simply want a product that's cheap to buy, that's easy to sell, that's difficult to trace back to them because it makes good money.
So you've quickly touched on it, but I think you may have examples of very bizarre smuggling methods and to support terrorism, but also locally. And you mentioned pigsties and pig farms.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that I thought was fascinating is, tobacco has a very particular smell. And especially if you're doing it, on a big scale, it's actually relatively easy for investigators who are poking around in your neighborhood to figure out where the tobacco manufacturing is taking place because you can smell it. And so, for instance, in China, they started using pigsties, so like big scale pig farming, because pigs are so smelly that they actually end up masking the smell of the tobacco. And so if you wanted to have a successful, like completely hidden tobacco manufacturing facility, you just surround it with some pigsties. And with some luck, the investigators won't smell when you're busy making your contraband cigarettes.
Okay, one of our webinar people, Claire Anderson, are asking, are the legal manufacturers in South Africa producing anything at the moment, or are the factories completely closed down? I also wondered about that. cigarettes, the sale of it, and I think also moving it from one place to another is banned. Manufacturing, do you know?
Well, so I can tell you this. We know that even after the ban, we know that BAT was raided by SARS. We don't know what the outcome of that raid was. So that already suggests that something was happening. But I think where government really slipped up is government gave these tobacco companies permission to continue manufacturing for the export market. And so they are still busy manufacturing purportedly for the export market. But I wrote an article a few weeks ago that shows that in May, the tobacco companies, the big tobacco companies, were exporting more cigarettes to Namibia in that 1 month than Namibians can smoke in a year. Okay, so that's what we call an oversupply issue. So what it suggests is they manufacture purportedly for the export market. They say that it's for the Namibian market, but instead those packs are being used to supply the local illicit market under the ban.
You've used these figures, exporting and importing figures, widely in your book to make arguments about this oversupply or undersupply in certain countries. Now, would you then think that there's something very fishy about this Namibian figure, and that cigarettes is actually coming back into South Africa being bootlegged? Is that what? Well,
absolutely. So when you look at the data, it paints a very worrying picture. So I did an analysis for, most of our close neighbors. In fact, we're even exporting to countries like Syria. And what happens is that somewhere between 66 and 80% of the cigarette exports from South Africa go missing somewhere along the supply chain. So they declared for export, but they never somehow end up in the country that they were destined for, which suggests that a very large percentage of these supposed exports are actually being sent back to South Africa and used to fuel the illicit market.
And that would then further suggest a very well-established smuggling network, which is worrying. And that takes us right back to authorities. Now, as international and local authorities are grappling with this problem, they're not only grappling with the problem of investigating illegal tobacco and smuggling, they're also investing on the other hand. So the PIC, the Public Investment Corporation, and some of our own pension funds and ourselves, our own portfolios, invest in listed companies. Now, our revenue service, SARS, picked up on the smuggling problem, and they picked up on the numbers that you investigated, and this seemingly oversupply to one country, but that there's actually cigarettes and tobacco products streaming across the border or circulating illegally in the border in South Africa. And they started in around 2012, 2013, Project Honey Badger, which was supposed to target the smuggling network. Tell us about that 2014 perfect storm that in the end ensured that Tomoyani was injected into SARS as the commissioner, how the investigative networks and investigative units were closed down, and tell us about Edward Zuma and political influence.
Oh, that's a long question. Right. So SARS for the longest time, especially under the kind of previous management of SARS, had extremely strong diagnostic and analytical capabilities. And so what they'd become really good at was following the money trail, right? So they were very good at unpacking who are the kingpins who sit behind the smuggling. So they're not arresting the poor truck driver who's crossing the border, but actually getting to the heart of where the money is going. And so on the basis of this, they launched Project Honey Badger, which was aimed at really cleaning up the entire tobacco industry. So everything from the small, value manufacturers to the big multinational companies. In the process of doing so, they obviously stepped on some very big toes. And what ended up happening was that particularly the big multinational companies have friends in very high places. So, there's a lot of evidence that shows how particularly a company like British American Tobacco had big friends at the State Security Agency. And between them, they had an incentive to make sure that the investigations into the tobacco industry didn't proceed. We also know around the same time that people at SARS had gotten evidence that implicated not just BAT, but also their security company, also individuals from the State Security Agency in smuggling, in money laundering, in corporate espionage. And so there was an incentive to get rid of the investigators and the management at SARS because they had the ability to blow the lid off a really big espionage and money laundering scam. And so, that's when the whole supposed rogue unit narrative was born. And that managed to get rid of most of the management at SARS. It got rid of all of the investigative capacity at SARS. It disbanded all of the investigative units. They stopped doing any audits of tobacco companies as Tom Moyane came in. And so once Tom Moyane was in place, the tobacco industry pretty much had kind of free reign. So we know also that Tom Moyane and Jacob Zuma, had a good relationship. They were relatively close. We also know that Jacob Zuma's son, Edward Zuma, was involved in a tobacco manufacturing facility. And so under this new dispensation, under Tom Moyane, it was dead easy for the tobacco companies to act with even more impunity. And all of the successes that Project Honey Badger had stood to make, all of that was lost. They had criminal cases ready to go. All of those cases disappeared. Nothing ever happened to them again.
Yeah, and that ensured that SARS lost its capacity to investigate, and they are slowly trying to claw that investigative capacity back, but we know that these things take time. We are getting very interesting questions, and people are loving you and the knowledge that you're sharing with us, so thank you for that. Fanny Fashveld wants to know what business sense would there be to manufacturing in South Africa, export to the European Union, and then re-importing it back to South Africa? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, so I know Fani. I know Fani very well. He's very good at what he does. So Fani, the answer is that they don't necessarily export to the European Union because the costs are just exorbitant to do that. What they tend to do is to export to some of our kind of more regional countries. So it would be Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho kind of exports, number one. But secondly, a lot of it, the export actually never takes place. So they present the documents to SARS with a proper stamp on it that shows that the cigarettes left the country, but they actually never left the country. So that's the one. But the other one that I think is more interesting is there seems to be some evidence of BAT in particular running what could be called a fictitious revenue scheme, right? And what seems to be happening is that they are putting cigarettes in a container, and that container is being shipped all the way around the world from country to country. And that very same container with the same cigarettes ends up back in South Africa. Now, there's no tax advantage to doing that, but what it probably does is it creates an Enron type of environment. So it could be that they are pretending to export big volumes for the sake of their shareholders as a way of manipulating perceptions that they are trading in high volumes. So I know that there's some speculation in the market that that could be one of the things that's at play, that they're inflating their export volumes as a way of keeping their shareholders happy.
Sure, I'm getting the chills. Fortunately, you also answered Alex Dale's question. You wanted to know if some of the exported cigarettes actually ever leave South Africa, and you expertly told us not necessarily so. Yusuf Ibrahim wants to know if it's actually plausible that in this time, in terms of COVID-19, tobacco companies would want to support the COVID or the cigarette ban, as it allowed them to sell illegally and perhaps make more profit. Would that make business sense as well?
It would make sense, but I think whether you're a small tobacco manufacturer or a big tobacco manufacturer, I think he knows very well that they know how to play politics. They know how to play to the media. So, I think publicly it would make sense for them to say, Of course, we don't support the ban because we are legitimate businessmen. This is the picture that we want government and the public to have of us. We run legitimate businesses. We have no control over where our packs end up. So of course we're not supplying the illegal market. But I think that it's one of those cases where it's almost a schizophrenic industry, in the sense that they want to have the public and government have one view of them, when in fact behind the scenes it's slightly different. I think there's ample evidence that all of the tobacco companies, as we speak, are benefiting from the ban. But there's also evidence of all of them saying publicly, of course, we don't benefit from the ban, and of course, we don't support it.
So on that ban, and Tate Tebogo Klaas is saying that he saw people smoking openly at the funeral of ANC stalwart Andrew Mlangeni. So we're postulating that maybe the ban might be only helping to fuel the bootlegging and the smuggling trade. What do you think?
Absolutely. Look, I've been very vocal about the fact that I think the ban was an extremely poor policy choice. So, in principle, I support government's intentions to reduce smoking prevalence in South Africa. I think that's an honorable objective on their part. But the ban, I think, as any ban would do, has simply fueled illicit trade exponentially. And I think we can tie it almost to a type of tax revolt, where taxpayers are going to use not paying taxes on their cigarettes as a way of punishing a government that they view as captured and corrupt. So I think it was an extremely poor policy choice. I think there would have been other ways of achieving something similar. And I think it's cost government a lot of goodwill amongst both smokers and non-smokers. Can we trust government to make sound policy choices? And on this one, the answer is clearly no.
Last question relating to smuggling and what we've been talking about. Can we put a figure on the tax revenue lost when Project Honey Badger was stopped or imploded?
Well, so we know that just based on the findings of Honey Badger itself, they had identified, I think, 3 billion rands in, kind of unpaid duties. But we also know that they hadn't finished their investigation yet. So that was just the preliminary finding, kind of before they were shut down. So they identified 3 billion. And, we'll probably never reclaim that. We know that now under the ban, I think the estimate is around 35 million rand a day that we're losing, because of course 100% of cigarette sales today are illegal. So today it's around $35 million rand a day. In terms of Honey Badger itself, it was around 3 billion, but that was before they could even conclude all of their investigations.
So we're moving right along to the manipulation of the public, and maybe this question of sasha planting is a good starter. Are there any angels in this mix, or are they all just bad?
I don't think there are any angels in this mix. I think there are potentially people in the industry who believe that the companies are trying to do the right thing, who believe in their corporate social responsibility angles and whatnot. But I think they are naive. I think the companies themselves, whether they're big or small, I think there are definitely no angels in this industry.
So we know from your book and from experience that tobacco manufacturers want to control what we think. When we've seen it through the ages. We've seen it in their advertisements about an easier birth if your feet is small, where they manipulate facts to suit their ends. We know that they have Kent manufactured by L'Oreal in 1954. You published this ad in your book where they advertise a micronite filter and how it is actually by scientists and educators endorsed. But they never told that this filter actually contained asbestos. Philip Morris, the same. They marketed this throat-tested cigarette. They used former US President Ronald Reagan in Chesterfield ads. the manipulation of the public and the knowledge or the intelligence system of tobacco manufacturers is top notch. And you mentioned tobacco manufacturers as marketing intelligence system. Now that would make the hair stand on end in any journalist's neck, because that's what we are all about, is not being manipulated, telling the truth, shining the light on the facts. But even journalists sometimes do get sucked into this, and we've seen that in Sunday Times, and how they supported and wrote about the tobacco wars in SARS. So can you tell us the dirty tricks used against the public in this marketing intelligence system, and how is it set up?
Well, so look, basically, again, the tobacco industry historically was very good at documenting all of these decisions and, kind of tactics of these. So we know for a fact that the tobacco industry knows the value of being able to control what we read and being able to control what we think. So when you look at, newspaper articles, editorials, whatever it may be, roughly 85% of tobacco-related articles come from either the tobacco industry itself directly, or from proxies or ghostwriters who write on their behalf. And a lot of this includes public figures. We've got a very visible figure in South Africa who, for the longest time has been fronting for the tobacco companies and kind of, speaking their rhetoric, using their rhetoric to tell us what we should believe. So I'll give you an example. When I started doing research on illicit trade in South Africa in particular, I started quoting a figure that said South Africa is in the top 5 countries in the world in terms of the prevalence of illicit cigarettes on the market. So I was happily using that because I'd read it in so many places. It turns out that it's wrong. It turns out that it was a phrase that TISA, the Tobacco Institute of Southern Africa, randomly threw into some communication with journalists at some point, and it became embedded in the way we view illicit trade, to the extent that nobody ever went back to question, where does this come from? South Africa at that point was nowhere near, being in the top 5 countries with the highest illicit prevalence. But they were using that to argue against an increase in tax rates, all right? And so there are multiple examples where the rhetoric and the propaganda that we read is intended to make us believe that multinational tobacco companies are the good guys. They are the guys who are going to help us fight against illicit tobacco. They are the guys who are going to help us take down the bad smaller guys, because if you're a small manufacturer, you must necessarily inherently be, an illicit manufacturer. You must necessarily inherently be criminal. So all of the propaganda and the rhetoric that we have been exposed to historically is meant to position big tobacco companies as the good guys. We're the ones who are helping SARS. We are the ones helping the police. And we are on government side. You don't need to regulate us because we're very good at regulating ourselves, but you need to be regulating the small bad guys. And that's everything we read is aimed at getting us to believe that message. And if they don't put their name on it, they'll put the name of somebody who we trust or who we think we can trust. And that's how it becomes part of our lingo. That's how it becomes part of what we think we know. But they have an incentive to spread rhetoric that serves their own purposes.
That's very informative because it feeds right into the internal politics in South Africa as well. So what you've just said was one of the tactics also being used against Adriano Mazzotti and Carney Links, and his links with the EFF leaders have been exposed for various reasons, rightfully so. ATM's links with Edward Zuma has been exposed, rightfully so. Now people are also, of course, wondering about Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and does she have any overt links with the smaller tobacco manufacturers? We know that she has links with Adriano Mazzotti as well, but it can't be that these small guys are all bad, right? So we also have to investigate the larger part in which they play in smuggling in South Africa, of course. But I gather from what you're saying that it's not the picture necessarily of what's being painted.
No, so if you were a customs officer or a policeman and you had two containers in front of you, one from British American Tobacco and one from Carnelix, which one would you detain? Which one would you stop to inspect the documents? I can guarantee it'll be the Carnelix container that you'll stop, right? Because we believe that, the Carnelix guys would necessarily be bad. Well, I tell you what, I suspect that they are definitely not angels. There's ample evidence that shows that their packs are definitely fueling the illicit market. But there's just as much evidence that the BAT packs and the Philip Morris packs and the JTI packs are similarly being, funneled to the black market. And so it's really about bringing balance to our policy decisions. It's about bringing balance to our enforcement activities so that we focus equally on the big guys and the small guys.
So is the ANC benefiting from the tobacco ban, Telita?
Oh, it's become such a big question. I've made an effort to really look into it, and I haven't found any evidence, any hard evidence that shows that particularly Mrs. Dlamini Zuma has benefited from it. We know that there's evidence of pre-lockdown Jacob Zuma having benefited from tobacco smuggling through a company called Royal Sonic. Royal Sonic made their money smuggling tobacco. And we know that Royal Sonic was making payments of, I think, 150,000 Rand a month to Jacob Zuma. So there's definitely evidence of him having benefited from tobacco smuggling. Mrs. Dlamini Zuma, I haven't seen any evidence. Did Mazotti donate caps and I think T-shirts to her election campaign? Yes, he did. Does that necessarily mean that she's benefiting from, sales either from him or from Edward Zuma? I don't think it's a compelling story.
Let's move on from manipulating and smuggling to it's all about the market share and the dirty games tobacco manufacturers play against each other. They spy on each other, they disrupt their competition, they include tactics like illegal surveillance, sabotage, infiltrations. Tell us about what happened inside the SARS 2014 debacle and how the lawyer was used by British American Tobacco to help them spy on their competition.
Oh, so Belinda Walter she's a fascinating character. So she's a lawyer, and at the time she was acting for Adriana Mazzotti's Carnelix. So she had a tobacco company as a client. At the time, she was also an agent for British American Tobacco. So she was being paid by BAT to spy on Carnelix. At the same time, she was also a registered agent with the State Security Agency. So she was passing information on to all of these guys. Then it seems that together with the State Security Agency, they conspired to set up an industry organization to represent the smaller tobacco manufacturers so that she could get even more inside information into the dealings of the smaller low-cost manufacturers. So she set up FITA. So she now had, fingers in every tobacco pie in the country. And historically, she's been acting for a lot of very interesting tobacco smugglers. So then it seems that British American Tobacco got antsy about, especially Johan van Logrenberg at SARS, because he had evidence of their corporate espionage shenanigans. He had evidence of their money laundering and smuggling activities. And he had evidence, I think, of one particular type of evasion that would have netted SARS an additional 2 billion Rand. So he was becoming a problem. So so BAT and the State Security Agency hooked Belinda Walter up with some surveillance equipment, and they sent her to essentially infiltrate Johan van Logrenberg. So she met up with him, and they had a relationship. without him knowing that she had been set up as a honey trap. So she had been sent to find any kind of dirt on him that would, give back the State Security Agency the ability to get rid of him at SARS. And so she was a triple agent, kind of spying on everybody for everybody. But I think in the end, the drama probably just got too much for her. So she came clean to Johan van Lochenberg and wanted to make good. So she gave him even more evidence of what BAT and the State Security Agency and the security company FSS had been up to. And so now, SARS and Johan van Lochenberg had this additional evidence. But then Belinda Walter and van Lochenberg ended their relationship. And of course, her handlers at the State Security Agency and at BAT, they were absolutely mortified that she had handed over this evidence implicating them. So they had to somehow discredit the information that Johan van Lochenberg now had. And the way they discredited it was actually pretty smart. So they simply said, if evidence was obtained illegally, it can't be used in a subsequent court case. And so, so they very simply started with this claim that SARS had run an, illegal rogue unit that had intercepted Belinda Walter's communications, and so that the evidence that van Lochenberg had been obtained illegally, to taint that evidence so it couldn't be used against them. And that's where the whole rogue unit narrative came from. That's where it was born.
And that cost South Africa and really expert, good investigators in SARS very dearly. So Johan van Lochenberg sent us a question. He wants to know if you can help us understand that facts and irrefutable evidence implicating BAT SA, FSS, and multi-agency tobacco task teams in racketeering, corruption, tax fraud, and that these were properly investigated by several panels, several investigators, including the Sikakani panel, KPMG, the Kruin Board, the Inspector General of Intelligence, the Hawks, and the Secrets, the SSA, State Security Agency. Why was none of this ever mentioned in any of their reports? And I think that it might be exactly what you've been telling us, and a question encompassing everything.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the tobacco industry being extremely good at capturing governments. So they capture our policymakers, they capture our enforcement agencies, and they very definitely captured elements of the State Security Agency. And when you have that kind of power, on your side, it's extremely difficult for another narrative to take hold. So I know many of those panels, they never even interviewed Johan van Lochenberg. How do you make a finding when the key witness, the person, who's at the center of it all, never even got a chance to testify? So I think, when it comes to the tobacco industry, we're up against really, really powerful people. We say that, Mazotti has Julius Malema as a patron. I tell you what, I reckon having the State Security Agency as your political patron gives you far more power than Julius Malema would ever be able to give someone like Mazotti.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also not, again, let's go bigger quickly because our time is running out, but it's not South Africa, it's not a South African specific problem. If you look at British American tobacco and how they employed Ewan Duncan, which is so aptly described as a war dog, and he was apparently the Queen's most senior military intelligence officer in Iraq, and how he came to train back to security agency forensic security services. Briefly tell us about that tactic.
Well, so what we see, it's just astonishing. So there was a small security company that was started by some policemen who come from what is essentially a, kind of a riot squad background. So they're not experts in investigating, doing like forensic investigations. They're not, guys who know how to keep a docket or how to run a corporate espionage ring. They kind of boots on the grounds kind of guy. So Ewan Duncan was recruited by BAT to essentially train people like FSS in terms of, you know, how to conduct industrial espionage. They ended up having an extremely sophisticated like management information system that was really good at tracking all of their activities. And so, you know, why would you get someone who was literally running, you know, intelligence operations in Iraq? Why would a company like BAT need him to focus on their small competitors? Well, I tell you why, because they literally ended up with access to their competitors' Wi-Fi password, so they could watch their security videos and the cameras and see what's going on.
Wow.
You know, they were placing tracker beacons on their competitors' vehicles. They were going through their competitors' dustbins to kind of try and piece together evidence. They knew exactly at what speeds their competitors' machines were running. It was an extremely sophisticated espionage ring that was being run. And it was largely being driven by the experience of people who, in the book, I describe him as a war dog kind of come to clean up, you know. And there's evidence that suggests they're not doing it just in South Africa. They're running the same kind of scheme everywhere in the world.
Let's move on to our last topic. Are they too big to fail? That's a very problematic question, and it leaves us with so many thoughts. And maybe the first thought is that courts right over the world found against various large manufacturers and legitimate companies, listed companies, for cigarette smuggling. Why do they keep getting away with this, Telita?
Well, again, I think it plays to a number of things. The fact is, you know, so the tobacco industry is under pressure, but you have to remember that a company like British American Tobacco has been the best performing company on the British Stock Exchange for the past 35 years. So pressure or not, these companies are making an astonishing amount of profit still. And so typically what's been happening is even if they are fined for, you know, smuggling or for corruption or for bribery or for money laundering, they end up, you know, simply paying the fine and walking away. So that's the one part of it, is that they literally have the ability to buy themselves out of trouble. But the other aspect that I've explored is that, especially in a country like South Africa, 30 billion rand of our pension fund money, government employees' pension fund money, is invested in British American Tobacco stocks. Oh. So if something were to happen to BAT, government employees would stand to lose a lot of money. Then there's a third angle, you know, so we know that the European Anti-Fraud Office, OLAF, they're busy investigating BAT for money laundering, corruption, kind of spanning across a range of countries. I think part of the challenge they face is that if BAT in London were to be charged with money laundering, they would have to delist. And, you know, the consequences to the financial system, if a company like BAT had to delist while facing these charges, would simply be phenomenal, you know. So I think there's an element where governments are almost too scared to take on these companies. There's also an element where, you know, BAT has said they were investigating what had happened in South Africa with this corporate espionage ring. It's been years and they simply don't get back to us. And, you know, we jump from crisis to crisis. We jump from scandal to scandal. And in the end, they never held to account for what they did wrong, because we have short memories and the public moves on to the next scandal.
And the news cycle is so quick. You describe a very difficult conundrum. On the one hand, we have SARS and the Hawks and the State Security Agency were supposed to investigate any wrongdoing and supposed to investigate smuggling in the large and the small tobacco manufacturers. But on the other hand, we have government structures and ourselves, our private pension funds, who invest in these listed companies. And it seems as if you say that there will always be tension, and that tension will perhaps be sorted out and won by a strong government who just try to squash the right thing to do in the end. Is that a correct reading of what you're saying?
Yeah, so look, I think what we need are highly competent investigators who have the guts to take on these guys because they're extremely powerful. And we need governments who are not, bound to tobacco industry with golden chains, and who are willing to do the right thing. And yeah.
Thank you. 1 minute answer. Eric Nettling wants to know, looking forward, what is your opinion about the effectiveness of tracking and tracing policies, especially with South Africa being a signatory to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control?
I tell you, tracking and tracing, I reckon, is the single biggest investment South Africa in particular can make. So right now, you find a pack on the local market. There's no way of knowing whether it's a legal pack. You don't know where it came from. You can't tell when it was produced. South Africa has this crazy diamond stamp nonsense on the bottom of its cigarette packs. That stamp is dead easy to counterfeit. It means absolutely nothing. So a track and trace system, what it does is it sticks a little label on a cigarette pack as it's manufactured. And that label has a tax value. So you buy the labels and you kind of pay the tax in exchange for the labels. So when a pack has a label on it, it shows that the tax has been paid on that particular pack. But more than that, on this little label, it has a little track and trace code, which means when you find a pack on the market anywhere in the world, you can identify where the pack was made, what date it was made, using what machinery. And so it's very easy to trace illicit packs in particular back to their manufacturers so that you can actually hold them to account when their illicit packs end up on the black market. SARS has been promising to introduce a track and trace system since 2007. They haven't. And in large part, they haven't because the tobacco industry is so powerful and the tobacco industry has lobbied against it because it's the last thing the tobacco industry needs.
Of course. I have friends who suggested that maybe an answer would be to inform your private pension fund and your private wealth managers not to invest in listed tobacco companies, especially because you say that there are no angels here. And that might be one option. Just before we have the last question to Telita, because our time is unfortunately done, I want to remind you that Dirty Tobacco, her book, is available at a 10% discount under the offer tab at the bottom of the chat. So look at offers, there's a red button and you can buy it there for 10% less. Now, Telita, last question, to turn our entire conversation on its head. You wrote an awful lot about British American tobacco, its role, its dirty tricks, its manipulating tricks, and how they're controlling our politicians and our hawks. How can we trust you that you weren't paid by a bad competitor to write this book, and that dirty tobacco isn't just, in fact, another dirty trick?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So a number of ways. The first thing is, my dad was a very heavy smoker. He bled to death on my mom's kitchen floor. I will not be associated with any tobacco company because I find their products problematic from a personal perspective, So the first thing is, hell no, I'm not going to be working for any tobacco company because, I find their products problematic. The reason I focused on the big guys was simply because I thought it was a story that hadn't been told. I would be very happy to write the same kind of story, but focusing on the smaller tobacco manufacturers. So, maybe that's the next book. But I think, if you go back to all of the work I've done, I've always been vocally critical of the tobacco industry in general. So I have no associations with any tobacco companies or industry organizations because, generally speaking, I find it a very odd industry to be involved in. So I don't have any alliances with anybody else in the industry.
Thank you so much for your time. I wish we had more time to chat to you. I can see there are so many more questions for you. We really appreciate it. your time and telling us about your book and your findings and educating us and helping us to be more careful with the messages that we receive. And just again, lastly, to the Maverick Insiders, you are very much appreciated. Thank you. Good day.